This presentation was recorded at the 2015 ANZICS ACCCN Annual Scientific Meeting.
And it's my pleasure to introduce our final speaker in this session, Dr. Jack Iwashyna. Jack's from the University of Michigan in the US, as well as Veterans Affairs Centre for Clinical Management in Research, and it's a great privilege for Australia to be hosting him on his sabbatical at the ANZICS Research Centre in Melbourne. Welcome, Matt.
Thank you. So it's an honor to be here, and usually I would start by thanking the organizers, but whoever on the organizing committee thought, gee, let's have Renee talk, and let's have Liz talk, and then put Jack up there afterwards. It was just, what the fuck? So those were really good. Really good. Okay. So how am I supposed to follow that with slides? Okay. So today, quick disclaimer slide before I say anything else. I work for the U.S. government. The Obama administration does not have a policy on ICU survivorship, neither does the Department of Veteran Affairs. Speaking for myself. I'm also going to be talking about a program that is being run by the Society of Critical Care Medicine, which has a process for vetting slides, but I didn't go through it. So this is just my own opinion. And I particularly need to thank two people who have been on a journey with me for about 4 or 5 years. We've been trying to convince SCCM that this was a thing worth doing. Mark Michelson and Giora Netzer, who've been profoundly inspirational to me. And then I'd also like to highlight Kimberly Haynes from the Austin, who I've gotten to know during my sabbatical here over the last year, who's doing some really interesting work in thinking about partnerships and really taught me a lot. I don't know how one would develop a relevant financial conflict of interest on this, but I don't have one. So let's start at the very beginning, which is to say the kind of transformational notion of that survivorship is a thing we should even think about as critical care professionals. So in 2004, Gordon Bernard has just completed the Prowess trial. It is probably the single best sepsis trialist in the United States and arguably the world at that point. Kind of the Sandy Peak, John Myberg's, Ronaldo Bellomo's sort of caliber, like the US version, so it's not quite that good. And so he gets asked by a newspaper, is there a residue in sepsis survivors who've had multi-organ dysfunctions? And 11 years ago, Gordon summarizes what's very much the state of the art at that point by saying no. Most people return to near normal or near normal lives even if they've had severe organ failures. Persistent problems are rare. Most surviving patients come back to being normal. And this is what many of us in the room, some of you look like you're not out of high school yet, but those of us who've been doing this game for a little while, so as many of us were taught, right, that sepsis and most critical illness is acutely life-threatening, but it's not life-changing. We know that's just wrong. A variety of brilliant work has built a very compelling case that there's a large number of problems among patients who've survived ICU. Some of my own work suggests that nearly 3 out of 5 older sepsis survivors have worse disability or cognitive impairment afterwards compared to who they were a year before sepsis. And these are not just concentrated among the patients who are acutely worse, but anybody sick enough to touch an ICU is at real risk of this going out. So what we know is that there's a problem. I'm going to do a couple slides because although I raised my hand when Liz said I asked if we were scienced out, it's kind of the only shtick I do, so I'll give a couple slides of science. But then I'm going to talk about that problem translating into a need and a unique opportunity to meet that need, to think about the way partnering with patients, particularly in the context of in-person support groups, could offer a way to go to span the entire spectrum of survivorship, to be good for patients sort of from the moment they wake up from their rapid sequence intubation to potentially decades later, and could potentially be transformational for the way we do critical care. Obviously, when you give a talk that says you're going to talk about how something can be potentially transformational, I'm going to vary off the science for a little bit there and get aspirational towards the back, but I think it'll be pretty obvious. And then we're going to talk about SCCM's efforts to do this. SCCM is primarily a North American organization, but it's explicitly international in its mandate. So everything we're talking about here, there would be great interest in SCCM and having Australian partners in that, whether that's within the context of the ANZICS or within SCCM itself. So Christopher Hitchens was one of my favorite writers, guy who died a death of esophageal cancer, which frankly nobody who knew his life was terribly surprised by that was the way he died. This was essentially, there's never been a picture of him that I can tell where he's not both smoking and drinking. But he had a horrible bout of sepsis while he was going through chemotherapy and wrote a lovely piece in Vanity Fair arguing that that which does not kill you makes you weaker. And the data is very compelling. This is some muscle stimulation data from my physiotherapy colleagues. They can explain this to you better than I can. The top line is how much muscle force you get from when you make a muscle twitch if you've been a healthy volunteer just lying in bed. Conversely, that much lower line, that weaker line, is what happens when you try to make a patient with sepsis and multi-organ failure twitch. We've got other data that looks at patients who have cognitive impairment. This is a slightly complicated graph, so let me take you through it. The bars on the left side are looking at life before sepsis, so people who were surveyed a year and 3 years before sepsis and given a survey that basically let us assess whether they had a degree of severe cognitive impairment. And about 6% do. Among those same 623 people who were interviewed before, we looked at the group who survived, and among the exact same patients, the incidence of moderate to severe cognitive impairment pops up from 6% to 16%. 1 in 10 who survived the ICU leave with big deal cognitive impairment. This isn't a subtle inability to kind of remember, be quite as good at Jeopardy as you were. This is a real big problem. And if you want to do that in a multivariate regression sense, it's a tripling of your odds developing moderate to severe cognitive impairment after sepsis versus your age-adjusted likelihood beforehand. And indeed, a German group just did this fascinating study where they asked everybody who'd been in the ICU to come back, and they MRI'd their brain. And if you're the kind of person who MRIs brains, you can count, I think they're called voxels, sort of little volume squares. And it turns out normal brains have bigger hippocampi, which is one of kind of the central memory and emotion processing phases, than people who've survived sepsis. There's a statistically significant shrinkage of the brain, specifically in a key part of the brain. There are lots of problems with the study design, but I think the general point that this takes a profound toll on people looks real. And so what we know is there's a long list of problems that have been disproportionately prevalent among critical illness survivors. Some of these problems are new and caused by critical illness. Some of these problems have been around, but nobody dealt with them before, and we find them in the ICU, and so even though we didn't cause it, it's our pile of poop that we have to fix and figure out how to move forward with. And we know that many of these problems are ones that the US and frankly the Australian healthcare system are poor at detecting and managing in the outpatient settings. They're the kind of things that aren't heart failure, the host of other problems that people have trouble with. So there's a need. We know that survivors have a host of problems, and we suggest that there's a technology that's quite mature in other fields that we haven't used after the ICU and that we should use. And that technology is face-to-face conversation with other people. So we know that survivors need pragmatic advice on the practical problems of dealing with their new bodies, of how to survive in a world where their bodies don't work like they used to. They need emotional coping strategies to deal with the having faced death, something many of us, luckily, have never had to do. And they need community and validation. So what are the existing resources? We did a survey of every ICU in the state of Michigan and asked, how often do you talk about these things with your patients? Now, these were self-report. Knowing the way this survey was generated, these are probably overestimates of how many people. And the big answer was basically nobody ever talks to their patients about what life after the ICU is going to be like. You know, there's 27% in the almost never. There was 17% with many but not all patients, 37%, it varies by practitioner, which I suggest is a way of saying most don't do it, but there's that sometimes Liz rounds, and when Liz rounds, she does a really good job of it. So the next thing you do is kind of go out onto the web, right? Every time I go out to start a family meeting, I see somebody's on Google trying to learn something. So what do you get? There's an incredibly powerful YouTube video that's up there by a woman named Paige Ward, who's a sepsis survivor out of Calgary, that talks about sort of her needs. And what she says is, at the beginning of 2013, there was exactly one easy-to-find video online that spoke to the needs of sepsis survivors. So there exists no community understanding, which is fundamentally one of the most powerful factors for potential recovery. There's a big gap. Well, but maybe this is a big gap everywhere. So we went to check. So yesterday, when I was sitting in the audience of another talk, I went and Googled, said, let's see what you guys got. So Googled support group, cancer, Australia, New Zealand. And it turns out you guys have all these awesome support groups, right, for cancer. It's really easy to find one, and there's a whole host of them. Said, okay, well, maybe that's just cancer. Everything works better in cancer. If you're in the ICU, you've got chronic oncology envy. What about heart disease? And again, a whole bunch of really nice support groups pop up. So I said, okay, maybe it's just been a North American problem. Maybe, like so many other things, things are just better in Australia and New Zealand than they are in North America. So let's throw in critical illness. So it turns out New Zealand has a really nice support group directory, and you'll notice Google puts the word that it was unable to find as the missing underneath there, and it's missing critical. So there's nothing for critical illness. As you go down, you can get some stuff about mental health. You can find critical illness insurance, which I don't know what that is, or why in a world that has a civilized approach to healthcare insurance, as you do, one would buy separate critical illness insurance. But it's certainly not a support group. You do get to support groups at the fourth hit, but it's not obvious that bipolar disorder is exactly the same thing as critical illness. All right, so maybe critical illness is too vague. We all know that's not a term that resonates with people. Let's try sepsis. And you get the same nothing in the Australia and New Zealand, so pull it back, support group sepsis. First thing looks promising, Faces of Sepsis from the Sepsis Alliance. So let's see, it says, I have a question about life after sepsis, but I've found no support groups yet. So Google's suggesting nothing, right? That the existing space is wide open. If you spend time on Twitter or Facebook, there are informal groups being run by survivors exists all the time, with the extraordinary heterogeneity that you would expect in that. But when we think about how we can promote a culture of resilience, come back to this beautiful editorial by Mark Michelson that I strongly recommend to you that has this incredible Maya Angelou quote. There's no greater agony than bearing an untold story inside of you. And as we talked earlier today about transitions, so many of what we do is when people in the ICU, they know they're sick, and everybody tells them they're sick. But then after a day or two on the wards, exactly as Renee was telling them, we say, you're not sick enough to be in the hospital anymore. And we all know that means you're still plenty sick, but there's just not stuff we can do for you. But what I would suggest is huge numbers of people here is you're not sick anymore. And that's probably not how they feel. So what can organized medicine do about this? And before I talk much about SCCM, talk about the organization, it's probably worth talking about SCCM, because I hear there isn't an equivalent organization here. So SCCM is not the College of Intensive Care Medicine in the US. That role is probably closest paid by the American Thoracic Society, which is overwhelmingly a physician and physician scientist dominated organization. SCCM was founded in the 70s with the rise of the ICU as an explicitly multidisciplinary organization. That commitment's embodied best in the way that the leadership is structured, so that the leadership rotates by professional group on a triennial basis. So one year it's a physician, the next year it's a nurse, the next year it's someone else. And then a physician, nurse, someone else, all the way through. Pharmacists, physiotherapists have held the position. Likewise, for those of you who attended the session on gender that was so beautiful during the ICU safety conversation. Actually, 55% of SCCM's board is women. It's done an extraordinary job of being open to folks, and I'm very proud that they've been supportive of this initiative as well. So we did a little bit of a literature review and asked kind of what are the array of strategies that are under consideration to improve the post-intensive care syndrome. And there's a bunch, right? And there's no compelling evidence that anyone's better than the other one. Indeed, there's not as much compelling evidence as we'd like that any of them are really effective as we currently work. Some's to reduce sedation. Some is the just add physiotherapy approach to making people better. There's the arguments for about psychiatric and mental health follow-up. There's some fascinating work being done in Germany about primary care integration. Increasingly, there's a group of people who feel like nobody else is going to do it. I'm just going to have to open my own damn post-ICU clinic and follow people up. We want to suggest that survivor peer-to-peer support is something that we haven't talked enough about. And let me run through a little bit by what we mean by peer support. So most generally, the Thrive program from SCCM is about trying to build capacity within SCCM to catalyze the development of in-person and virtual support groups, and then use that capacity to enable broad participation of and support from survivors as a part of SCCM's mission. Frankly, as a built-in part, the question is, should we add a fourth part of the rotation to SCCM? Should there be partners who are fully co-equal members of a professional organization? Should patients and survivors as a fully co-equal member of the Society of Critical Care Medicine? I don't know if we're going to get there yet, but that's what we're thinking. Thrive's initial research has kind of 4 pieces. Thrive's initial 3-year agenda has 4 pieces. One is to build a collaborative network to support local sites in building in-person support groups. One is funding innovative research on recovery, and we just gave away $150,000 to help get that jump-started. One's integrating multi-professional education and making sure everybody knows what PICS is, so that nobody ever answers like Gordon Bernard did again. And one's developing online research, resources and interactive spaces. The heart of what we've been doing, though, is really the in-person support. So we thought we'd start. We asked the Michigan hospitals, do any of you have an in-person support group? While admitted in the ICU, the answer was yes, about 10%, which were overwhelmingly for folks who are in stroke or trauma units, not for folks who are in other medical critical care units. And you have a support group for people after discharge for the ICU, and the answer was just no. When we start thinking about this, we need to define some terms. So the first term is who is a supporter, who is a survivor? And to my mind, and to the mind of many of us who've been in this room, at the bedside of a loved one, it's a patient or their loved one. And we know that both of them, particularly the loved ones, go through extraordinary acute symptomatology while their loved one's in the ICU bed. And that the spouses of families in the ICU are just devastated by the experience of that. Giora Netzer's developed this really nice framework for thinking about sort of the family ICU syndrome and the challenges that are faced to partners. When do we involve them? To my mind, the answer is when the ICU is a salient part of their life, all the way across the continuum of recovery, from the moment of ICU care through late adaptation. And we expect that people would want different things at different times. Sometimes, when you're early on, you're there for support. Later on, part of your healing may be actually finding ways to speak from your experience and give to others. We know for people who've survived breast cancer, we know for people who've recovered from alcoholism, that kind of 12th step process of giving back can be extraordinarily powerful. It's our guess, we've got no evidence of this, but it's our guess that we can do that same thing for people who've survived. It sounds, frankly, Renee, if I can reinterpret your experience a little bit, that's part of what's been great about your job, is your ability to sort of lean back, look back, and sort of use your experience to help other people survive and survive better. And that's extraordinarily powerful when people have the courage to do that. We should build an institutional support to make it easy for them to do that. So what are we talking about? We have very strong opinions. These are not supposed to be clinician-dominated. You read the literature, it's quite clear we don't know what the hell we're doing to improve survivorship. This is not about people coming back to the ICU to be told what to do right. This is about peers working together to talk about their experience and to share tips that worked for them. That's a little scary. if you're an ICU clinician, the thought you're going to give over control, I'm an ICU doc, right? Like, honestly, if I really like talking to people, I probably wouldn't be in the field I'm in. And the thought that I would actually let people just mingle together and sort stuff out on their own, it can be a little terrifying. It feels very clear that that's the right thing. And then what we need is an organization that can help take the best ideas and bring them forward for other people. What do we need? We need coping strategies for concrete problems. It's about pragmatic advice. It's about emotional coping strategies, not just teaching. This is about the teaching people to fish, not just giving them a fish at a moment. It's about community and validation. And it's certainly not the sort of thing that people joke about when they think about a support group, right? People coming to be told, like, God, we're thirsty. Yeah, I'm really thirsty too. It's about structuring those conversations so people can talk about how they found the water together. So how do we do that? I don't know. So what we thought we'd do is throw some money at the problem. Slightly American solution, and it's not much money. And so what we did is we threw up a bid for RFPs to invite people to join a collaborative network. About 12 people submitted really compelling RFPs. We asked for 1 page of information. Some people gave us 15 pages of single-space 9-point information. We went through and read about picked 5 that we thought were well-positioned to be able to both test different interesting models in a variety of academic, community, and children's hospital settings, and we're willing to get together on the phone once a month to talk about what was working and what wasn't working, so we could use that leverage of that collaborative networks to move forward. We anticipate having 5 new sites add each year, so that by 2017 we'll be at 15 sites on these calls, and we're explicitly international in our charge. Because it is our hope that these network of in-person support groups can serve as the centerpiece that drives an entire ecosystem of a potentially transformational approach to critical care. That we have partners in our professional societies, that patients and survivors become partners in advancing research and improving our own practice, providing us meaningful feedback about what we do well and what we can do better. That we think about using this to educate non-ICU clinicians about the challenges of survivorship. So just like every GP knows that someone who's been through anthracyclines needs echoes periodically, they know what people who survive the ICU should be worried about. And we then leverage this to build online supports. And I think we have to do this. One of the questions is this our responsibility, or can we let other people do it? To my mind, it's a moral imperative for us to be engaged with survivors, that if we're going to continue as a specialty, they need to help advocate for us, frankly, to be self-interested in the way that they advocate for the cancer docs and the heart disease docs. That we think it's good for us, has great potential for patients. And frankly, the online support is going to happen whether we're there or not. So it's our job to help provide a little knowledge and science behind it. And so this is the part where I get really kind of homily-ish. But I think if we really want to be better, we need to understand our own processes of care and outcomes. Patients' perspectives provide new and distinct information about how we're doing. We need to welcome and indeed seek out that information. Or, I fear, we as a profession and a set of professions working in the ICU risk becoming just another self-serving trade group, clamoring on for its own benefit. If we're really about making patients better, we need to invite them in as partners to tell us how to do that, as terrifying as that may be. So, if you're a clinician in the room, what do? We're at the just try stuff stage. Pick your favorite strategy and try it, and find some meaningful way to engage your patients in telling you what you can do better in your own unit. We don't know. There isn't best practice here. This isn't time for the big comparative effectiveness trial. This is time for people to take risks and do innovative stuff in the face of a new and pressing need that no one had recognized before. Thank you very much for your attention. I think it's lunchtime, so I don't know how much time we have for questions, but I'm certainly happy to stick around afterwards, too. Thank you.